Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helper-Parker. I am back with Doug Braun-Harvey, back doing our series on the 6 principles of sexual health. And today we get to talk about honesty, which makes me want to break out in song. Honesty, such a long word. But I will stop
so untrue.
Save everybody from my...
Well, I'll tell you my favorite song lyric about honesty.
Yeah, tell me.
It comes from my college years with Paul Simon. He has a song called Tenderness from his There Goes Rhyming Simon album.
I love Simon.
And the lyric is, I need some tenderness beneath your honesty.
Beneath your honesty. Ooh, lovely.
And I think that you'll hear that chord throughout this discussion of honesty, that it's always needing to be balanced with other interpersonal and relational contexts.
Well, and I think that hits right to the core of so many of the issues that I see that come in through my office where honesty is actually avoided because people do not want to hurt others or even hurt themselves, right? So I think probably one of the biggest reasons why we see dishonesty, or at least not as much transparency in some situations, is because of that very thing. My honesty might be actually very painful for you.
The honesty sexual health principle, I think, is one of the ones that, particularly in my model of working with out-of-control sexual behavior, where there's these competing motivations, there's a tension between competing agendas or outcomes or goals. And I think with honesty, when people are struggling with a choice or a decision to be honesty, I don't think it's about being dishonest for most people. I think it's about a competing, equally or even more compelling motivation that overrides the value or the ethic or the intention of transparency and honesty. It's difficult in relationships when people are less than fully transparent in situations. Is it too often the narrative gets immediately kind of quickly put into a being dishonest or a liar or you betrayed me, which is sort of focusing on the solution, that the lack of honesty is the solution to a dilemma. And oftentimes the first step in the honesty isn't even necessarily delving deeper into the facts that weren't disclosed. The first step in the honesty is sort of, can I tell you what was so conflictual for me, or what was so tension-filled for me, or what I was so torn about, that led me to conclude that the best way out of that dilemma was to be less than forthcoming with you.
Yeah, I love that. I talk about it in kind of Mormon language a lot with the idea of competing principles, so kind of even doctrinally or even scripturally, right from the get-go in Mormonism, we have the story of Adam and Eve, and Mormonism does that story a little bit differently in that we don't really see Eve as having made a mistake, but she had 2 competing principles, so she had the principle of obedience, so just to follow the law, not to eat the fruit. But then there was this other principle, which is to grow and to progress. And she couldn't really progress without knowledge and without losing innocence. And so there's kind of a double bind there. So there's an interesting play there for Mormons, I think, to look at this a little bit more complex. It's not just about, oh, you did this one thing wrong. It's like, well, maybe that was wrong to lie, like you just mentioned so nicely. It's in the context of some other values, some other principles, some other relational concern as to maybe I don't feel safe telling you this. And I see this all the time with couples, right? I mean, they'll say, tell me, and then they tell, and then they're kind of almost castigated with that knowledge. Like now that I have that knowledge, I'm going to use it against you, And so because that knowledge does hurt oftentimes, I'm telling you something that threatens you or that you don't like to hear or that is different from your values or, myriad of things. So
I think you're bringing up another dilemma with honesty discussions is, this sort of tell me, which puts the focus on the gesture of transparency. It's as if the action of full transparency is heavily weighted with meaning and attachment and love or whatever it might mean to have that full transparency. But in order to have the full transparency, you have to learn something about somebody. You have to maybe get some information about somebody you didn't know before. You have to understand an aspect of their personality or who they are, or the person is sort of basically letting you in. Here's a part of me. Here's something about me you're going to now know. And those two events are happening simultaneously. And the reaction, the emotional reaction, tends to be, I think, more informed by the disappointment or fear of what I've learned about you. And then therefore the gesture of I'm wanting you to know me gets lost. There actually was a gesture of connection. There was okay, I'm going to move out of this protective space. I'm going to have you join me in a place that I've been avoidant or not wanting you to know about me, or I've been too ashamed to have anybody know about. And I'm going to let you in. And then immediately, that process gets lost and the focus is on the content.
Yeah. And do you want to give some examples of how this plays out in real life? Like, what are some of the themes that are very typical for this to be happening in?
I'm going to talk about my clients with men with out of control sexual behavior. That's a lot of what I work from, but I think these tensions are inherent. And one of the things that's often can happen, let's say around somebody viewing sexual imagery for pleasure, orgasm, maybe in solo sex or something like that. And one of the things that they haven't been honest about, let's say, or they haven't been forthcoming about is the kind of things they like to watch, what kind of imagery. And so oftentimes when a partner's solo sex activity that involves looking at sexual imagery comes out into the open, there can be a kind of preoccupation in the couple for either hiding what the person is looking at for arousal, or the other person wanting to know what the person is looking at for arousal. And this becomes a form of contention and, will we or won't we talk about? And then let's say eventually the couple decides, maybe they're in couples therapy or in their own process decide, let's sit down. I'm going to show you the kind of things I look at. And these are true stories. I mean, I've seen couples I've worked with have done this. So they get the laptop out and, they'll kind of show the person a little bit of some of the images they like. And the first thing the partner looks at them is with utter disgust. You like that? And this sort of, I'm going to let you into my private erotic world. I'm going to be kind of, vulnerable and honest with you here. Here's really what turns me on. And the first reaction isn't the process of, wow, thank you for letting me see that. Have you ever shown this to anybody before? I mean, what's it like for you to have me see this part of your life that is usually all by yourself? That's all gone. And the only thing gets focused on is the other person's disgust or reaction to the imagery their partner is looking at. As if you've just told me something about yourself that calls into question how I could even love you. What does it say about me if I love somebody who likes that?
And oftentimes I think what it is too, because I'd like to talk a little bit about this. Why is this? Because I'd like to give some grace to those who respond this way. Why do we respond? Why, if we've been allowed to be let in, why do we, instead of doing what you said, react oftentimes in harmful ways or in ways that kind of we shoot ourselves in the foot, right? We're saying, I want honesty. I want you to be open with me. And then when we finally get it, we kind of do exactly the opposite of what would ever have that person be honest with us again, right? By responding in these ways. So what plays into that? And one of my ideas, but I'd like to hear your ideas, is that it threatens our sense of either our own erotic template, if we're talking about sexuality, especially I think for women on the other side, if you're going to talk about men being on the side stereotypically that you're talking about, if you like that, or if that turns you on, or if there's something outside of me, the woman, the wife, the partner, then that's a threat to our relationship. I'm supposed to be the end all be all of your sexual pleasure, your sexual desire. If I'm not, the message I've received from a very early age as a woman is that I'm not sexy enough. I'm not desirable enough. I'm not good enough. I'm frigid. I'm this, I'm that, whatever these messages are that women get, that we're just supposed to be everything, right? For the man of we're supposed to be the object of the desire. But do you have other thoughts about that? I mean, that's maybe.
Well, no, I think what you're saying then is if a relationship moves to this dialogue I'm going to say perhaps the reaction, what the whole narrative we've just talked about, is an unprepared couple for this interaction. Has the partner really been consciously aware of the messages they've had their whole life? Does this partner know, let's say, their gendered script around desire and attractiveness and love and in value and attachment in a relationship is around this universal idea that I'm the one and only object of desire? And that if I don't meet that standard, there's something less than about me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that I believe, most adults don't know how to deconstruct that affective state like you just did. They're not sitting there going, oh yeah, here's that place where I think I'm supposed to be the one and only object of your desire, and that's the social script we've been given, and that's what it means for me to be an adequate and vital human being and partner and woman. And here's a story that conflicts with that. And of course, I'm going to take that personally because I don't see it as a gendered script I've been given. I hear it as something that is the actual truth of the world, and therefore is actually a fact about me, is that I'm now an inferior person.
Mm-hmm.
And the person I love the most in the world has just confirmed with me that I am an inferior person. Mm-hmm. And what in the world do I do with that?
Yeah.
And all this is happening, and of course, nobody knows how to say any of this.
Mm-hmm.
All they're doing is feeling the horrible shame or feeling the horrible veracity of those gendered and religious and sacred and cultural stories all in one vortex, being like an assaultive punch to the gut that says you are not enough and never will be.
Well, if anybody gets anything out of this podcast, this is, I hope, what people get is that we can have empathy for people on both sides of this discussion, right? One of the largest motivations for not being completely honest is exactly that, avoiding shame. And one of the biggest reasons why people react negatively or maybe less than positively, less than what we would like, is because they're also dealing with shame. Yes. And if we can come from that space of empathy for each other, right? That these are really hard things. We have not been given the skills to be able to have these types of conversations.
My sexual health conversation skill that I use in a lot of trainings, and I don't mean just with therapists, I train a wide range of people in these principles of sexual health. And when we get to the honesty principle, I tend to say to people, we could spend the rest of the day here. People are wondering how to work with this principle of human interaction.
Yeah.
Basically their whole life, right? I mean, we're always negotiating our degrees of transparency and candor and being known or not known. As you put it, we're managing perceived levels of threat, and particularly the threat of shame is a huge perceptual risk that is an algorithm for when we choose to be honest or not. That's the way the world. It doesn't mean people are bad. But what I like to teach people, and let's say I'm teaching social workers in Los Angeles County who work with foster youth, and they're dealing with a foster youth in a car, and they're driving them somewhere, and the youth in the middle of the drive asks the social worker, and maybe the foster youth is 10, and the foster youth looks up, in the back seat, and the driver is driving, their social worker, and the youth says, what's a blowjob? And there it is, right? They honestly want to know. Something happened at school. They don't know what this is, and they don't want to be uncool and not what it is. So they vulnerably go to somebody that they can maybe be a little more vulnerable with. And if they're in foster care, it might be that social worker because they don't have a home to go home to that necessarily feel like this is something they can talk about. And maybe this is the person who they had the least shameful interactions with. And so it's like, all right, I'll give them a shot. And of course, the social worker is not prepared at all for this question and driving the car. And so what I talk with social workers is about, there's a brief 15-second exercise you can do. When anybody brings something on you about their sexual life or sexuality and you're unprepared for it. And it's just two things. One is you just quickly but very calmly take a nice deep breath. And then you look at the person, or you very calmly say to the person, I really appreciate you being honest with me about that. And then see where the conversation goes. What we know from talking to teenagers and talking with children and even in families, when these sort of vulnerable questions are asked, the last thing somebody expects is that the person's first and foremost, no matter what you said, first and foremost, the person's going to appreciate the human moment of the movement towards honesty. That we're going to give a 15-second space to appreciate this human moment before we move into all the terror and the fear and the shame and the judgment and the conflict or whatever else that might emerge. We're just going to give 15 seconds of airtime to that first.
That is such a beautiful way to frame that. I think if we could all do that, conversations would go a lot better. And even when they don't go well, because they won't always go well,
No.
that you've immediately framed at least the first piece of it through a positive lens, through a positive interaction and through the interaction of respect, right? And
yes.
And
yes.
I think that's very important.
The reason I like to share that story and go through it in the detail I did is because I think this could be a real gift if a parent is listening and wondering, what am I going to do when my child starts asking me questions about sex or starts telling me things about their sexual activity that just disgusts me or enrages me or terrifies me, which sometimes your family members are going to come to you with aspects of who they are sexually that you are going to have enormously terrifying reactions to. And so that's okay. I mean, you're going to have that. But, wouldn't it be interesting if the very first thing your family member remembers about these difficult conversations is that there at least was the wherewithal for the listener to have some appreciation for the fact that this person has come to me with something very difficult to say and has chosen to be honest.
Yeah. That's great. I love that. I don't know if you'll like my questions, so you're always welcome to shut my questions down. But I'd like to have a discussion on what, in your mind, are some of the more typical things, especially when it comes to sexuality, that we tend to balk at being honest about. What are the things that we struggle being vulnerable around? So
what are the things about it? What are the things about our sexual lives?
Yeah.
That conflict with the risk of shame or judgment. Yeah. And that the persons typically resolve that conflict of risk of shame or judgment by being less than honest or even deceptive.
Yes.
What are the typical sexual situations where that's the solution people come up with?
Yes.
All right. I'm going to give some general storylines and then maybe we can talk about some specifics. I think when somebody is not fulfilling gender or sexual orientation expectations. In other words, they're not the feminine, gendered person that they're expected to be. They're not the masculine, gendered person they're expected to be. So this could be an example of a child wanting to play in gender non-conforming play interests, wear clothes that aren't the sort of typically gender conforming, or have interests that they want their son to be interested in or that they want their daughter to be interested in. And so children will hide. And they'll learn very quickly the shame response that will be directed at them for those kinds of interests. And
which oftentimes can be nonverbal even.
Exactly. It can just be the look. It can be the tone of voice. It can be the posture of the body. In fact, when we talk with adults and do sex histories or go over developmental sexual milestones with youth in their childhood as now adults, and they remember reflectively, adults are far more better at going vividly and distinctly into the moment and remembering a facial expression of the parent or of the friend or the dating partner, or they can remember the tone of voice. They don't necessarily remember everything accurately at all what they said.
Right.
So these are moments that, can happen early. And so when children are hiding or not being honest about certain things, oftentimes that's a shame avoidant response to not conforming to a very specific idea of who they are supposed to be as either a gendered person, the assumption being that everybody grows to be heterosexual. And that when children begin to perhaps look or sound in ways in which they may not fulfill that script, depending on the context, and we're here to talk about what it might be like in a context of the religious community and the religious faith community that you're here to have your listeners who maybe most commonly be from, what that must be like. What are the honesty dilemmas of when a person's religious beliefs, expectations, goodness of a person, good in the eyes of God, what happens if they need to be honest with you, it means they're going to tell you something that's not good in the eyes of God.
Yeah, our word for that is worthiness.
Worthiness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you say more about that? I'm just interested.
Yeah. So, well, we even, there's a lot going on right now actually in the news around this, worthiness interviews, which is kind of this idea that you go in and talk with your ecclesiastical leader, and there's a set of questions that most of us have been asked about a variety of things, but one of them is our sexual morality. And so are you following what would be called the law of chastity, which means that you're in essence promising to only have sexual relations with a spouse. And in our culture, for many, that even means masturbation, even though that's complicated when you really look at our history and our doctrine around that, it's not as clear. But at least culturally, that seems to be the understanding for a lot of people. And so from a very early age, these worthiness interviews start at baptism, which is age 8, but they really start for real at age 12 when they enter the young men's or young women's program, and they're expected to go to the temple. And, there's just more things. The boys get the priesthood. And so you need to be found worthy to be able to do these things. There's concern there, right? Because right away, your sense of worth as an individual and how God sees you, in some ways, unfortunately, I think very behaviorally driven. So if I'm acting in certain ways, I'm not worthy or I am worthy. You can start seeing how this starts being problematic for a lot of people as far as how they see themselves. And in my line of work, it's very common to start seeing sexual shame right from those very first interviews around things like masturbation, erotic material viewing, not necessarily penile vaginal intercourse, but other types of sexual play, or, maybe I touched her boobs or she touched his penis or things like that. Anything premarital that might be happening from the ages of 12 to 18, prior to marriage, prior to young adulthood. These are things that oftentimes come up in these interviews.
A couple of things I'll comment on just listening. I really appreciate you going through all of that because, you've really given me a way to think about now what you said from a sexual health conversation perspective, and particularly on honesty. One phrase you used was behaviorally driven. And so I don't know, Natasha, if we've spoken about these ideas, and when we get to values, we'll talk more about it, but act-centered sexual values versus principle-centered sexual values. And that in religious systems tend to have one value system of these two as the sexual value systems in their faith system. And what you seem to be saying by behaviorally driven is that in the Mormon sexual value system, it's very much an act-centered value system, that certain acts, behaviors, actual things people do have a moral dimension around sexuality and worthiness in the eyes of God.
Yes, I would agree with that.
And then it's specific acts. And another value system is a principle value system. So that it's, even though the acts may vary, when that sex act was engaged in, was it aligned with these principles? Was it consensual? Was it non-exploitive? Was it honest? Was it shared values? Was it protection from STIs? Was there some interest in mutual pleasure and that it was about pleasure? That's a principle-centered, right? So what you're saying is that oftentimes in an act-centered system, the tension between honesty and shame and these things is different because the sex act will be the focal point. In a principle-centered system, the tension is going to be about, were you upholding the principles?
That's exactly right. And this is where I try, and many are very open to this once they kind of understand these principles, and why I think these principles are so wonderful and why I want to do this series with you is just pointing out, for example, that rape happens in marital, vaginal, penile, missionary position sex, right? So here's all these things that you would think would be protective. It's not kinky. It's not within the bounds of marriage. It's pretty vanilla. It's kind of what most people might consider quote unquote normal sex, although that's an issue all in itself. But that is very typical. And yet in the context, it can be a rape, right? And so whereas masturbation, which might be considered a sin, in the context of a young adult who maybe isn't married and doesn't want to go too far with their partner, that they don't feel ready to go that far, that can be a very useful way to have sexual release. Or even in a marriage where there's libido discrepancies and one partner doesn't want to pressure the other partner and wants to be loving, but wants to also take care of their own sexual needs, and they've contracted that in an honest way, and it helps them manage that. You can see exactly what you're saying, right? That these acts can be used for good or bad when you look at it from the principle perspective, versus getting stuck in this idea that this particular thing is bad all the time or this particular thing is good all the time.
Right. There are two very different value systems. And what I am glad you're welcoming your listeners to hear, it's not that one value system is privileged or better than the other. Each value system creates their own conflicts around honesty. In your example, what language I would use is that even though in an act-centered system, the sexual acts are completely congruent with everything in their religious and value and moral system, it could be non-consensual and forced sex. Isn't that interesting?
Right.
Or do your moral standards of around acts say that it is immoral in the eyes of God to have forced sex between two people? I don't know where it says that.
Right.
So that's the combination of an act-centered and a principle-centered. And you can see how trying to put those two together is really interesting when I ask different systems. So I'll ask a principle-centered system, how do you talk about these specific sex acts? Sex is still a behavior. Yeah, you have to get down to specifics, right? So what's consent? What activity compromise consent? The principle's consent, but what are the activities? Neither value system escapes the discussion of both.
Right.
But depending on which value system is your lead card will determine the conflicts around honesty. So here's what I would say one of the conflicts you have is, what does your religious and moral system say about where a human being gets to have an orgasm when they are not in a heterosexual marriage? What to that? Right, yeah. Right. Where is this supposed to happen, and how is this supposed to happen?
Right. Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, in Mormonism, we really don't make room for that. We really take an asexual approach to, and I'm not sure if I'm really using that term correctly because that's an orientation really in of itself, but we're expecting people.
I would invite you to try to say what you're going to say by using the word orgasm, because I'm going to say it's this physiological event the body has. And the religion seems to have a statement about where and under what circumstances our bodies can be right with God and have that experience.
And I think, unfortunately, it's really only in marriage or in ways that you're not making a choice. So for example, a wet dream, during the middle of the night, that would be an okay time to have an orgasm. And that's about it, if you're not married. So therein lies a huge struggle for those of us who are within the system and love our system and respect our values and things of that nature. And at the same time, understand that's a fairly rigid stance. And at least in my opinion, that's a fairly rigid stance and leaves many people with, I think, the sense that they're failing at that expectation, right? Because we still know that Mormons masturbate. Mormon teens are masturbating. Mormon teens are having some sexual exploration with boyfriends and girlfriends and things of that nature. And so this gets even harder even for older adults. I mean, I've had stories where a widow in her 60s was asked if she was masturbating, and that would have been seen as incorrect, behavior in that particular context. Again, this differs, right? It's not like every single bishop out there will ask that question of a 60-year-old woman. And some bishops might be very like, oh, that's no big deal. And other bishops may actually say, well, maybe you shouldn't, partake of the sacrament for a few weeks. So you have a bit of a spectrum. It's not totally correlated within the system. So
what's interesting from the honesty principle then, Natasha, is what you seem to be describing is then, okay, that's the values, that's the morals. Then when you're in a position in your religious system where you are choosing to be honest, which is a good thing, right? In your moral system, if you're talking to the hierarchy within your religious system and you're choosing, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to actually let you in and tell you what's happening. then it creates the threat and risk of the response. One of the things you've described already is that it can be subjective.
Yes. Oh, it is very subjective. This is a lot of the pain I see coming through my office, especially with some kids who weren't allowed to go on a mission, other kids who were allowed to go on a mission, some people who were allowed to marry in the temple, some who were not, all due to some of these subjective meetings with different leaders who took different approaches to these types of disciplines, that we have within our system. And then, of course, I also see the types of personalities, right? So I have the kids who from the get-go kind of had the wide-eyed look and I'm not going to tell you anything. So they start lying right away, and then they feel guilt about lying. So then we've got this kind of sexual development happening in this shameful secret place. That's a very common narrative. You've got the other kids who are super forthcoming all the time. So they're kind of confessing almost every week. And now they're going, they're being treated by addiction specialists, and the bishops are referring them because they're obviously addicts because they're coming in weekly to confess. That also is a very common story. I mean, it just is really interesting how this plays out, how teens from a very early age in Mormonism have to navigate and figure out what's the level of risk for honesty. And even though I don't know that we would say it's public shaming, it is public shaming because you notice if somebody's not taking the sacrament. If you're a young man and you're not passing the sacrament, people notice that. People notice if you didn't get married in the temple. So people notice if you can't go to the temple, right? So even though nobody's getting up, in the middle of the pulpit and saying, brother so-and-so is currently being punished for this sexual sin, we definitely have ways that we can kind of figure out something's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, I think, probably assume something sexual is going on. Why else? It's not like we talk a lot about embezzlement or cheating on your SAT scores or other reasons why, these disciplinary things might be happening. So it's a really interesting mix, in my culture around these issues. And unfortunately, the shame stories just kind of abound in my office.
One of the things I like to ask around honesty is asking somebody in their relationship, what would it be like if you had the option of saying to a person in your relationship, I'm not ready to be honest with you about it. I don't think I'm going to be honest with you about that. I don't think I'm at a place where I can be honest with you about that. Either I'm going to be honest with you and tell you that, or I'll just tell you something that's not true. But the third option, that I will be honest and transparent with you, the only honest thing I can say to you is, I'm not ready for that.
Yeah.
And
that's a great boundary. That is a great boundary. I love that role model. At the same time, I will say that if you try that in a bishop's office, the bishop will more than likely honor that, but they will still not give you the temple recommend you need. Does that make sense? So that's still, even that boundary will not get you what you need to not be publicly shamed. If that makes sense.
Right. But I wonder how it might feel differently to the person if they had the dignity and right in their own self. I'm really not prepared to be honest with you. Despite the consequence that the system may give, does that consequence feel different if the person only in themselves knows I was honest?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and even the implications of that in a marriage or in a parent-child relationship, or in a dating relationship. That's a wonderful boundary to be able to. And maybe it's too soon to go into this, but I wanted to have a discussion with you too about the difference between honesty and privacy. Where do we have the right to our own private thoughts, our own private ideas?
I think the formula that I would describe is the tension between secrecy and privacy. And that issue, the tension between secrecy and privacy, is another significant factor in the degree of honesty a person will have with another person. Do I have a right to privacy? And what areas of my life do I have a right to privacy about? And can I be honest with somebody if that's private? That's mine.
Yeah.
And can I be honest about that? Or do I have to somehow, once again, because it's too difficult to be straightforward about that's private, say things that's something that's not true, make things up? An example of this often is kids might hear the parents having sex. And somebody might say, Mommy, you and Daddy were making noise last night. Right? And Can a parent just say, there are things that mommy and daddy do that are completely private. And when our doors close, some things happen that are private. And, there may be another time in your life when you may find out what those are, but not today.
Yeah.
So it's not a secret. She's not denying that they were making noise, right?
Yeah.
She's not shaming the child for saying, how dare you bring that up? And she's not resorting to lying. Our jogging machine in there, we decided to get up and jog in the middle of the night. I don't know what they're going to make up, right? But
right.
Why? So these are the moments that are just so complicated in family life and church life and social media life. And any evidence of sexual activity or sexual pleasure is being possibly suspected or curious about by another person. And do we have the right to just say, that's private? I'm not going to keep it a secret that I was sexually, but it's private.
Mm-hmm. And this is probably the biggest challenge in a marital relationship, right? Or a long-term committed relationship, because I do think that the romantic script that's given in Western romance is that you're my soulmate, you're my lover, you're my best friend. I know everything about you. You know everything about me. It's almost like the contract is I stop being an individual in some ways, just in some of the ways that it's presented. Not that everybody has a marriage like that, right? But
right.
I think that people almost feel owed, like you owe me that information. You shouldn't have anything secret from me or private from me, which is the better term.
One of the things I've learned from sex researcher Pepper Schwartz, there's a lot of research around sexuality and has done some cross-cultural research. I heard her describe a study that was so interesting where, because you said Western culture, this is sort of the narrative. And this study actually showed what you're describing is American culture narratives. Because when you go to other countries, what got called sort of the fetishizing of full transparency tended to be a very American idea. Or when you got into other Western European countries, it varied much more as far as how much this level of transparency was romanticized and idealized. And what they found in the study, this is the thing that I found most interesting, the countries that had the least idealization of full honesty between couples reported the most satisfying sexual relationships.
Interesting. Which really kind of goes along with Esther Perel's work, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. This idea that full and complete transparency is the formula for robustly pleasurable and enduringly satisfying sexuality over the course of a lifetime. So that the more transparent we become after knowing each other longer, actually that will improve and create a greater, robust, and enduring sexual liveliness in a couple over time. And the research, cross-culturally in other countries, at least what the couples are reporting in these various countries in this research, disagrees with that idea.
Yeah. Because it lacks this idea of mystery and intimacy. And I think even this idea of friendship, that's a really funny one, because your friends know a lot about you. You disclose a lot to your friends, but I'm not necessarily having sex with my friends. I'm having sex with my husband.
Right. You don't have to worry about having dinner with your girlfriends and thinking, gee, how are our orgasms going to be with each other tonight? You're not, and that's not in the dinner, mind.
That's right.
But it might be when you're sitting with your husband or male or female partner over dinner.
Right. Yeah. 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 And this interplay of satisfying sexual encounters having a degree of mystery or of, surprise. And of course, in long-term relationships, that's partnered with stability and a lot of knowledge, so there's that tension between those two things, obviously. But I would agree with that. I think that that's a very interesting, and I actually have many couples where they're the best of friends and they're not having a good sex life. And they feel very confused by that. And I think that sometimes, even especially within the Mormon context, we usually, at least as young women, we kind of had these moments in our lessons where we'd write down all the things that we wanted in a spouse, so priesthood holder and good provider and kind, and and nobody ever put down like super hot, sexually attracted to this person. And so I think sometimes
ravages me weekly.
Ravages makes me lubricate just when I look at him. You know?
Right. I get wet when I take the meatloaf out of the oven.
So we're not taught really to look for that trait, that particular chemistry with somebody. And I do think, especially since there's an experience sexually and we're not supposed to be super sexual with each other prior to marriage, but my goodness, we're good friends and we know how to talk and you seem like a super nice person and I love you and let's get married, right? And then that doesn't necessarily translate into sexual compatibility always. And I see a lot of sadness around that, 10, 15 years down the road when they come in to see me finally.
Right. So in other words, I think about what you're saying is perhaps we've lacked good science when we've created these narratives. And when we have science that contradicts with those narratives, we're not fully honest and forthcoming with people. Guess what, folks? You can set up your relationships this way. But if you think a robust, highly erotic, and very pleasurable sexual experience is a kind of a tag-along that will be the benefit of this, we're going to be honest with you. That doesn't look to be quite as commonplace as we like to think.
It's not quite as equational.
Right. It's not quite as equational. Now, it may happen for some couples, but I think the reason it might happen for some couples is that kind of emotional connection fits well into each of their erotic maps. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, that's luck of the draw. Yeah. I mean, when typically when we fall in love with somebody, compatible erotic maps is not the primary story.
That's a meme right there. That statement you just said. I'm going to turn that into a meme.
What did I just say?
We don't fall in love with each other's erotic maps. Problem number one.
And we're certainly not encouraged to have that be a main storyline for why we fall in love.
Right. And then we spend a lifetime blaming each other or ourselves as to why those erotic maps don't match, which again is the script that we're given.
Right. Or some couples have this magical moment where one's erotic, kind of maybe unconventional erotic interest has been not disclosed. It's not been honest. They've been too afraid to disclose this kind of unconventional erotic interest. They're getting in a relationship. Maybe they're now in a committed relationship. Maybe they're now legally married in some way. They've created a family. I mean, it's all gone. And now the tension of not disclosing this kind of particular erotic interest is becoming untenable. And they decide, you know what? I'm going to say it to them. This is something I really like. So an example might be, you know what I really like? I really like a finger being digitally inserted with some nice lube into my anus when my penis is really hard and rub my prostate right before I have an orgasm. And it's like the best thing in the whole world. And this is a heterosexually identified man who thinks anything to do with the anus is a complete violation of all masculinity, all heterosexuality, and certainly a violation of making my pleasure that important. And so what do? They never tell anybody. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But what do? They might go pay somebody professionally to do this. Mm. They might look at sexual imagery where they see this activity engaged in and maybe explore with this activity by themselves alone. But what they're desiring, what they're yearning for, what they're wanting is a partner who shares this place with them. That's really what they want. To be honest about that is so frightening. In fact, they may avoid it so much that they're looking at sexual imagery and be completely preoccupied with looking at sexual imagery. And then the sexual imagery gets discovered. And what are they now? Well, now they're a porn addict. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the erotic conflict gets even more diluted through betrayal and hurt and injury and disgust and shame. When does this erotic interest maybe get honestly discussed? So then finally, it gets discussed in the couple, 15 years into the relationship. And the partner looks at this person who just disclosed this and says, well, that sounds kind of hot. Mm. And what I really find can happen sometimes, not in all stories, but can happen sometimes, is when we withhold who we are erotically, when we're not honest about who we are erotically, we're choosing not to know our partner.
Yeah.
This man would have never said to me, if I was his therapist, you know what? I'm afraid to tell my partner about this very, very peak, highly desirable erotic touch and pleasure, because my partner's going to enjoy it too.
Right.
I would never want to tell them that, because my God, they might like it too. I never hear that.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And yet, sometimes some people might be open to that, or might be willing to explore it because it means so much to their partner.
Right. And even if it doesn't go well, just the idea that we could have a conversation like that from a different perspective. Like, I'm so glad you told me, again, that honesty piece, I'm so glad you were able to share this with me. That doesn't sound at all like something that would turn me on. And yet there's nothing wrong with the fact that that turns you on, and just having that type of empathy, even if it doesn't ever make it into your actual sexual play together, can still be very liberating, and can increase intimacy in the sense of like, wow, I wasn't rejected necessarily for this. And that's where I think we really struggle, because coming full circle to where we started, it can feel so threatening. And this is what I hear oftentimes again from the partner is, but if they like that, what does that mean about me? That must mean I'm not enough. And boy, that's a very difficult script to undo, because even though I can, normalize, people come with all types of erotic wiring, and people come with all types of interests, and that really is kind of separate from their relational intimacies. And whether or not they'll incorporate that into the relational intimacies is kind of what we're talking about, but it's not necessarily a threat to how they feel about you. That is a tough cookie to unwind.
Well, one way, I didn't hear this in your scenario of all the various ways of how difficult this is to untie this knot. But one of the things, this really comes from MI, motivational interviewing approaches to working with change. And you're really describing when these erotic interests are disclosed to a pre-contemplator, somebody who has no interest in looking at or changing. They are not interested in anything about it. So we call them contemplators in a kind of more stage of readiness for change process. So what are ways to work with the pre-contemplator who has no interest in changing their erotic world, no matter what they've now learned about their partner? And so one of the ways to work with pre-contemplators is to ask them what they like about their current position. So if a person is saying what you just said, this is a threat to me, what does this mean about me? My whole training is that this is a reflection of me. Then you could stop and you could ask the person, what do you find meaningful and valuable about that way of operating in the world? How has that been meaningful to you? How has that helped you as a person? What's your understanding of how those ways of living in the world sexually as a person, and how you understand yourself as a viable, good person? How has it been helpful for you to organize it this way? Because pre-contemplators need to talk about what they like about what they do, not how they could think differently.
Right.
And so maybe somebody who has these worldviews that you've just described that are so painfully being challenged right now have never been given a chance to really articulate, here's why I think this. Here's why this social script I've been given is actually one I find value and meaning in. And they've never been able to just sort of organize that belief.
The thought process of that.
In a non-judgmental way, and then it doesn't have to hold up and compete with an alternative idea immediately. No. We're not going to hold it up to that. Let's just talk about how you see things.
Because otherwise the partner can feel, especially in a therapeutic position, like the therapist is siding with the betrayer, right? Or so now it's like a double-edged injury, right? Like not only did my partner do something that went against our contract and that I wasn't even aware of, and that has all this meaning that is so painful to me, and now my therapist is trying to explain this away or minimize it somehow, or which I'm sure I've been in that position where I've probably played that role for people as I'm trying to normalize things, or that's a really tricky aspect of it. And I think it happens the other way too, right? It happens where the therapist sides with the betrayed person, or, so now it's talking about addiction language and shaming the person who's coming in. So we as therapists oftentimes get in the way of all this
Right.
process.
And how I would hear what you've just described, Natasha, is from a clinical perspective, working with therapists, or if I was supervising a therapist who was telling me this. I think what you're describing is how therapists prematurely move to action, prematurely move to a kind of interpretation or a position or a rubric that must be in the room. Our profession doesn't train us well to work with people at the pre-contemplative stage of change. And so because we don't have good skills or good training, or we're not well practiced at regulating our own emotions when we're sitting with somebody who's a pre-contemplator, that the therapist will unwittingly try to move the therapy to another stage of change because that's where they know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
And so oftentimes
that's the bane of my supervision.
I wish your listeners could have seen your face just now, because you definitely looked like it was the bane of your work.
Well, right, because the last thing you want to do as a therapist is make things worse. And oftentimes we mess up too, right? So,
well, this is what I like about the stages of readiness for change and motivational interviewing model. It's very compassionate and it's very forgiving of everybody.
yeah.
So what you've just described, what they would call is a stage discrepant intervention. The therapist is at one stage of change and the client's at another.
Right.
And the therapist doesn't keep at the forefront. My interventions have to be matched with your stage of change, not where I want you to be.
Yeah, which even gets harder in couples work because each of the people in the room are at different stages of motivation as well. So, yeah.
And couples theory, and I'm a little out of my range here because I'm not a couples therapist, but I think one way to think about that is what would it be like to think systemically? What stage of change generally is this system at?
Right.
One person in the couple may be influencing the system far more. And so the system might be at this stage of change because of that, even though the individuals in the system might look different.
Yeah.
The system still has its own narrative that's in the room. And so the couples therapist oftentimes is in this dance between the individual people in the room and the system of the couple. And that's about as much as I can say about couples therapy, because it's not what I do. If we were talking about group therapy, I could talk about this much more because I'm a group therapist.
Right. It's amazing to me how quickly this time with you goes. We're at the end of the hour and I don't want to keep your time longer than I promised I would, but
so you're being honest with me and your viewers.
Yes. Trying to keep to my boundaries here.
Yes, that's right.
Instead of taking advantage of you non-consensually and continuing to ask you questions.
Right, and not keep the agreement.
Right, and not keep the agreement. So would you like to give us some closing thoughts? How would you kind of neatly wrap up this principle of honesty in a few sentences?
Somebody has actually listened to this conversation between you and I, and now it's the end of the podcast. I would really invite them to sort of take a moment, some point today, if they've listened to this podcast, or tomorrow if it's late at night, and see if there's one thing, just one thing, that if I could just find a way to be more honest about this with a particular person I have an important relationship with, what would the benefit to me be? We talk so often about the fears of being honest, but I hope one of the things that's come out of our conversation here today is there's enormous benefits from being honest that are also in the mix, that go with the threat and the shame. But boy, if honesty didn't have an advantage, we wouldn't have put it as one of the 6 principles of sexual health.
Yeah, for sure. And even to your point, where it may not go as you had relationally hoped or expected, or even within the system, like with the church system or something, back to your point when you made that boundary about I'm not ready to be honest or something along those lines, that there's something about the worth it has for you individually.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, Mormons do honesty pretty well. In fact, sometimes I think too well, to the point that there's no privacy. But if you have a mix of that, and if you can really be honest with yourself and have good boundaries, I think that can lead to great mental health and better relationships. And even if it's just a better relationship with yourself, that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doug.
Yeah. Well, as usual, I look forward to these conversations and value the level of discourse we get to engage in with each other. It's really,
I
really,
value it
really lovely.
as well, for sure. And I will be hitting shared values next. So
Alrighty.
we've got, and then pleasure. Woo, woo.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.